Would you consider the SP404 as an instrument? I've been super curious lately about the idea of playing the SP404 live. I mean, I'm like you. I cook up some beats before a show, I cut them into loops, I fill out the banks, and then, focus on the MFX, DJ FX looper while playing live. Standard SP404 protocol. And of course, there's finger drumming. But playing a live beat doesn't necessarily constitute being an instrument, right? If you're a guitarist, you can say, oh, I play guitar. Or a harpist can say, I play the harp. But what do we have to do to be able to say, I play the SP404? This is an experiment I conducted last weekend, and I wanted to use the scientific method of all things just to figure this out. The question I'm trying to answer is, what does it take to bring the SP404 into a live musical environment? One that requires improvisation with other musicians and being able to stay in time, in key, and just be able to make music on the go. Bit of background, I'm a musician. I play 20-something instruments. I started playing jazz when I was a kid, and now I'm living in China, focusing on combining lo-fi beat making with traditional Chinese instruments. I use the SP404 in almost every show, My hands are always busy using an instrument, and it's super nice to have a reliable sampler in the background just to have loops going. But the SP404 has just dominated my interest this year, so I wanted to approach this as a musician would any other instrument and see what we can do. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the process and share every single thing I found that worked, and especially the things that didn't. Real talk, this is going to be a super long video. If you want the TLDR, just skip to the last 2 chapters, and I will do my best to summarize it all. But stay tuned if you want to see the experience for yourself and maybe give this a go. Once a month in Chengdu, China, there's a small gathering of electronic musicians who get all their gear together on one table, are randomly paired up, and have to improvise a jam for 15 minutes. The catch is that you only get to use one device, so you have to choose wisely. Obviously, I'm in. First time, let's do it. And guess what I'm gonna bring? In group chat, everyone listed what it is they're gonna bring, and how they're gonna plan to synchronize with one another. It ended up being 6 devices from Electron, 1 Behringer DeepMind, and a lonely little SP404. This electric gym event would be the perfect environment to test out a hypothesis of using the SP404 as an instrument in a live setting, right? It's got minimal variables, I'd know exactly what gear I'd be up against, 15-minute time trials, a really casual, chill audience, just a great place to start overall. So, knowing the testing conditions, I started to plan what it is I needed to prepare for the SP404, and also what I wanted to try. This is what I would consider research. The obvious question is sync. How would I play in time with the other musicians on the SP404? Well, what if I wanted to use loops, like normal? Well, if I played a resampled drum loop, a guitarist may not have a problem with that, but an electronic musician is going to have to manually tap BPM to try and match the BPM of my loop. Rarely works live, in my experience. Or I could verbally tell them, like, hey, this loop is at 80 BPM, and I'm only going to use loops at 80 BPM, and we'll just do our best to stay in sync. But previous experience also tells me that it's going to go out of sync over time. It's just not a reliable way to work. If we want to stay in time using loops, we would need to rely on MIDI sync. That means only using the pattern sequencer. No resampled loops. Now, nearly all electronic music operates on a MIDI clock, and all these devices can accept MIDI in and MIDI out. SP404, as you might know, only has MIDI in, and cannot send a MIDI signal to another device. Therefore, the SP404 cannot lead the BPM in a MIDI clock sync setup. So how does MIDI sync work with the SP404? So, in theory, if you attach your SP404 to another device and change the MIDI sync mode to auto or sync, then the pattern mode would, in theory, stay in sync with an external device, assuming the settings are right. But to be honest, I tested it for a couple hours, and whatever reason, my SP404 would not accept any kind of MIDI sync in. And it might be my SP404, it might be a couple of my other devices, or maybe I was just too tired to figure it out. Regardless, I was having a real tough time getting MIDI sync to work on my SP404. You might have better luck than I do, so I definitely suggest you give it a try. Regardless, I decided that this method of using MIDI sync in also just couldn't be relied on in a live environment. Tried, maybe, but if something goes wrong, I couldn't leave myself to rely on it. Also consider, what if you're playing with a musician that has a modular setup and doesn't have MIDI sync at all? Or what if we're playing like with a normal drummer who also doesn't have MIDI sync built into his forehead? The answer to this question is you can't rely on MIDI sync. You can't assume your loops or even your like patterns will be viable in an improvised live environment. Because sometimes you can't lead the BPM, and sometimes you can't even follow the BPM. If you can rehearse and plan beforehand, sure, but if you're improvising, this BPM sync just might not work. Which means we're gonna have to do this by hand. Another question, what key are we in? And how do we stay in tune with the other musicians? Are we gonna prepare to play in any possible key? Most instruments like guitar, violin, trombone, these instruments are able to play in any key at all. A guitar player with like a reasonable amount of practice could, in theory, play with any other musician because they can change the key that they're playing in. A trombone player like me is most comfortable in the key of B flat, but of course could play in F sharp minor, whatever. It's just a little, it's not native. It's not like, it's a little harder. Now, some instruments like the hung or like a guqin, on the other hand, these instruments are designed to play in a singular key. A lot of small woodwind instruments are designed to play in one key. This guy from my Instagram video can only play in one key. If you want to play in a different key, you need multiple ones of these. And it's not a strange thing for someone to pull up with a bag with like 8 of these just for different keys. In this instance, an SP404 is like a bag of flutes or a couple of hung drums, not just one. We can't change the key of a sample. At least, like, not on the fly. But we can bring as many samples as we want. So a sample of a chord is in one key. We could cook up melodic samples in a single key. Vocal chops also are usually in a single key. Sometimes you get lucky and have samples that are kind of atonal and don't fit into a single key. Drums and percussion also generally don't have a key. So how do we prepare to play in any given key? This is where the context of where you're playing is going to be important. If, for example, you're playing with like a drummer or someone with a drum machine, then key doesn't matter, right? Because then you're playing music without a tone, and it doesn't matter which key you play in. You get to decide. Now, if you're playing with someone who only plays synth or a guitar or anything except for drums, then you're the one who will focus on the drums, and then there's no difficulty in arranging key at all. They get to decide. Is the solution really that simple? Like either play drums or play your own key? If you're playing with 2 people, then actually it could be, but that's a cop-out. Let's actually prepare to play in key with other musicians. Now, I've been jamming since I was in high school, and I can tell you reasonably, any amateur or semi-professional jam session, more often than not, is going to be able to accept someone who can only play in the keys of A minor, D minor, C major, G major, the common like middle school scales, right? These are all safe bets to prepare yourself. If you're at a jam and someone joins and says, hey, I can only play an F sharp major, let's play F sharp major, odds are they're the odd ones out, right? If you say, I'm sorry, I can only really play an A minor and D minor because I can't, that's all I brought, people will get it. That's like an acceptable thing. If you want to play with jazz musicians, you know, good luck. Although we do try jazz in this video towards the end. Stay tuned. It's crazy. To sum up, we're going to prepare to play largely in A minor and D minor. It's 2022. I don't think anyone's quite happy enough to play in the major keys, so we'll stick to minor. I'll also prepare some banks with other keys just in case, but I don't really expect that I'd use them. That is, of course, in addition to drum banks, which I will use if I'm paired with someone who wants to focus on the melody of the chords. Okay, we've discussed sync and we've discussed playing in key. What else should we be prepared for? First off, banks should be foolproof. And what I mean by that is you should be able to play them, and regardless of what you hit, it should generally sound good. It's hard enough to keep track of your banks when you don't have an audience in front of you, so we need to make sure that these banks don't rely on any kind of like memorization of what's inside of them, which banks have what. Any rules or habits that you have when you make kits? For example, always keeping your kick drum in the bottom left corner, or keeping your melodic chops on the secondary banks. That kind of stuff should be the basis of you building your kits. You've got to follow your gut because it's your gut that's going to serve you best when you're on stage. Another need that we have is a variety of different instruments and sounds on one card, right? If I'm playing for 15 minutes straight, I really don't want to get stuck doing one type of sound because the audience, like, and myself, like, we'll get bored, right? So we need to put some thought into the architecture of our SD card to make sure that we are not only prepared to play in time and rhythm, but we can also do more than one thing throughout the show. that leads us to our next need, is that I think we're going to need multiple SD cards, right? There's no way I could do multiple improvised shows just with 120 samples all on one memory card. Well, I mean, maybe you could, right? If one card to rule them all, that'd make a good sequel, right? But stay tuned. But I genuinely think we're gonna need a couple different cards that do different things in order to make sure that we're prepared for however many sets we end up having to play. Lastly, my memory is objectively terrible, and I have the mental bandwidth of like a peanut. So every card we make needs to have some kind of visual guide, so we can have some kind of reference while we're on stage, just to keep track of what bank does what. Maybe I can remember what A and F does, or B and G, but I don't think I could do all 10. So we need to make a guide to go along with all this. Now, the fun part, what is it that we want to try, right? First of all, vocal chops. To any non-beat makers that we're going to run into, when people think of sampling, they think of sampled vinyls and like chopped up vocals, right? I want to do the SP404 community right and bring some samples to this stage. So I'll dedicate at least one bank only to vocal chops. Next, I want at least one instrument that I feel is complete. 12 sounds is not very many when you think about how much a real instrument can actually do. Think about a piano, right? 88 keys. How much could you do if you only had 12 sampled notes? 12 chords, on the other hand, is a lot. That's plenty. But then if we only had those 12 chords, then there'd be no room for leads. So I'm going to pick one of my favorite instruments and spread it across multiple banks and try to really feel like I have enough samples from one sound, at least one sound. What else do I want? Cute video game sounds. Why? It's probably a stupid idea to dedicate a whole bank to like video game samples, but we all want to force like quirky ideas into our music sometimes, even if it like doesn't fit. So this is like a testament to that. Let's see what happens if I put in something that maybe doesn't belong. Maybe it'll work out great. Let's see how that works out for me. Now, personally, I really like using ambience, like field recordings. I've used birdsong and rain in performances before. It usually works out. I think generally it's kind of overdone if you use these sounds in like studio releases. But if you have some ambience loaded up for like live, then it's generally pretty cool. You know, it fills the air a little bit. So I definitely want to work ambience into this project as well. And the last thing I wanted to try is a very distinct woodwind, like a flute, with some portamento and some accents baked into the samples. I want to take one instrument and make it sound like more fleshed out. Again, only 12 samples is not very much for an instrument. But if we make one instrument particularly complex, then maybe we can kind of convince the audience that there's a little bit more to it than just pressing 12 buttons. Okay, all of that information is what we consider topic research. I think it's enough. It's time to start making some cards. These 3 SD cards will serve as my hypothesis, right? I have very limited experience doing this before, and I propose that the sounds that we come up with today on these 3 SD cards are going to be enough to serve you or me or any SP404 user in a live environment. That's a hypothesis. But that's just it, right? A hypothesis. Now, do I think this is the perfect way to go about it? No, absolutely not. I've never done this before. It's just a hypothesis. Actually, the whole time I was kind of expecting this whole thing to crash and burn and that every idea I had was wrong. But, you know, that's part of the scientific process. I'd say let's get cooking, see what we come up with. First up is the Kiwi card, right? This is what I consider my general use and sort of like main card because this is the one I put by far and large the most work into. Maybe like 3 to 4 times as much work into this card as the other cards. It's got a pretty healthy mix of like chords and drums and leads. It's got, I think, 2 drum kits and most of the stuff that I wanted to try. I started simple. Bank A is straight up resampled from Native Instruments pack called Halcyon Sky. Quick shout out, thank you to NI China for hooking me up with these samples. Now, these packs are usually a mix of like drum and some melodic stuff. Personally, I was a bit concerned with having a multiple use kit because my monkey brain prefers to keep things kind of more organized. Like I would love for these to all be drums and then maybe the one behind it to be the melodic samples. But I also figured maybe it's going to save my ass because my hands will be too busy to switch banks. So this is my test. A bank has multiple things in one bank. All right, behind that, on F, it's mostly vocal chops from a great folk singer called Vashti Bunyan. Just I don't use samples that much, but I found an artist who inspires me whenever I am able to chop up her voice like that. So Bank F is full of that, and obviously a couple instruments in theirs as well. Okay, moving on. B Bank is a sampled lead from the Mini Nova over here. Yeah, who knows? I wanted to try this lead. I like this sound a lot. And behind it on G is the bass. Another patch from the Novation Mini Nova. Both of these are in the key of A minor. Also another quick shout out. Thanks to Novation China for hooking me up as well. Now, banks C and H are my attempts to maximize that single instrument. I took my all-time favorite VST, which is called Siemno by Felt Instruments. It's a very cool old pianette, right? It's sort of like a piano. And I filled up both banks full of samples. Looking at H down here, it's only chords, I believe. Right now they're in gate mode, but you could also put them in one-shot mode if that's your thing. And moving up to C, C's got a mix of a little keyboard down here. And a couple of flares that I cooked up real quick. So that's my favorite sound, right? That's probably the favorite instrument that I have. And it only felt right to try and put this across two banks to see if I could sort of play them together and make something more complicated. So yeah, that's what I meant by complete instrument, and I think I did it justice. That's 24 pads for one instrument, and I think that should be enough. Okay, D has the flute that I was talking about. This is a Korean flute called the daegum, I think it's pronounced. I recorded it quite long with really long sustains so that they kind of serve as pads. And also every pad has sort of a unique performance method. Some are kind of like a bend up, some are down, a couple have tremolo. Yeah, who knows? That might just be too chaotic for me to use live, but I wanted to give it a try. Okay, so I has all of the ambience that we cooked up. Let's see what we have here. I think there's some rain. There's a crack of thunder over here. What else do we have? I think there's some bird sound in here. Frogs, of course. General nature sounds. And then I think there was one more. Fire, you know, why not? Let's see what happens. Okay, up here in E is a drum kit. It's a CR78 drum machine. I'm just not a big 808 fan. The CR78 has always been my favorite. It's just, you know, I just feel like it works anywhere. By the way, that makes a dope PO33 kit, because the samples are super short if you're looking for more drum sounds. And then lastly, I left J blank. Why? Because I figured, well, if I'm feeling ambitious or adventurous, then, you know, maybe I could do some live resampling, right? You could use the delay and turn the feedback all the way up, and then you have like a 1-bar loop pedal, and then you can resample that. Or, you know, if I have some time before the show and I hear something on the radio, I could resample into that. I don't know. I think it didn't hurt to have at least one bank just be empty. Also, you know, being honest, it was lazy. Next up is the cherry card. Now, I really wanted a place to put the video game samples, and I just built this cool 8-bit like drum kit thing that I really wanted to try out. So it seemed natural to put them together, and let's just build a whole card around this sort of chiptunes video game vibe, right? A is another kit from Native Instruments, and this one seemed to be mostly kind of ambient hits. Let's see how useful that one's gonna be. Okay, and F is where we have our video game samples.
It's a new lap record!
All right, going over here, B is a fun lead called a cream lead. Beneath that, we have a sort of square bass, a fat chips bass. All right, up here in C, we have like a cool like square sine wave thing I made. And then H is only chords. It's like it's a square sort of wave shape. D has one of my favorite patches from the Mini Nova, which is called Gentle Drip. Yeah, very FTL style. I like that. I has one last lead, which is called like a chip lead. Real similar, just with a bit more reverb and a little bit softer, obviously. E has that 8-bit kit that I built that I really wanted to try out. And lastly, J blank. This card was mostly leads, right? I figured this card would be cool if I'm jamming with someone who's doing drums and some kind of like tonal texture, whether it's like chords or some kind of running bass line, whatever it is. The whole dynamic range covered by other musicians, and I'm kind of stuck in maybe like the lead area. But, you know, there's some chords, there's a drum kit, there's a couple different things happening here, and admittedly, I wasn't very confident with this card, but, you know, let's see how it goes. All right, and lastly is the Blueberry card. Now, this one is almost entirely drum-based, though most of the kits have some melodic samples kicking around there as well. A lot of these came straight from Machine. I did not put much time into this card at all, okay? You know, let me get that out of the gate right now. Pardon the guide, these two are flipped. A is called the Kingstroke kit. You know, who knows? Maybe that's the best kit. I don't think so, but we'll see. We'll see what comes in handy. One other type of kit that we definitely need to consider is percussion, right? Percussion is the kind of thing you can bring to any jam, and you'll always be accepted just to add a little bit to the rhythm section. You know, you can play in any key, And, you're not necessarily going to fight the drum section if there is a drummer, right? So I wanted 2 kits on here that are strictly some kind of cool percussion. So F, I believe, is some tablas. Similarly, up here we have a sabar kit, which is like a kind of like a djembe. This one's kind of like a flare. I feel like that one's going to bother us. But the rest. I kind of feel like that's a last-ditch strategy to add something to the jam. In case I have nothing else that works, I can always come back to adding a little bit of percussion. We also have another pre-built kit here called the Tasman kit. Now, those melodic bits, that chord and that bass line, are certainly going to be in a key. I've written here they're in the key of F minor, which really wouldn't get along well with a jam in the key of A minor, most likely. So I'll need to remember, and I've written here, that I can only use this kit. I can only use the melodic parts of this kit if the jam happens to be in F minor. Spoiler alert, that is a really bad idea, and I should have probably just tuned these to A minor, set myself up for failure. But again, let's see if it helps. All right, so over here in C, I have a very cool kit from Machina called Deep London. I like this one because it's a little more like percussion based than most drum kits. I also really like the sound of these 2 kicks here. A little more like deep house style, which again, depending on who we're playing with, might really come in handy. And Bank H has something called the Purple Waterfall kit. Yeah, who knows? That's a little bit more complicated than I would like. I mean, there's definitely some cool sounds in here, but I'm not going to remember what they sound like, and I'm not going to be able to make that calculation of will they sound good in the jam at this current moment. I would have loved to make all these banks by myself, but to be honest, it took a long time to make the Kiwi card, which I made everything by hand. Whereas this card took me like 15 minutes to just sample these and get these all together. And I wanted to get you as much data out of this video as I could, and I didn't have all that much time to prepare before Electric Gym started. So I wanted to throw this kind of kit in as well, just to give us a little bit more information. I highly advise you, if you can, make your own kits, make your own sounds, put some real love and time into it. These kind of kits are great for like quick ideas and whatnot. They're not going to have as much personality as something you make yourself. And you're not always going to have that contextual memory of what they are unless you build it yourself, or you just use it a lot. But, like, hey, if you don't have homemade drum sounds, store-bought is fine. D is one of my all-time favorite drum kits, just like a really nice, kind of dusty. The kind of drum kit that actually sounds like it belongs on an SP404. Down here on I have a slightly cleaner kit called a Shaolin kit. Now, E is sort of the odd part of the experiment. It's an odd one. I put pretty much 1 chord per pad, and I made it so that these 2 could be a progression, these 2 could be a progression, and each one has different sounds. For example, this one's D minor to C, whereas this one's C minor to B flat. This one's called Rainfall, G minor to F. My logic with this bank is that if I'm in this card, then that probably means that there's other people playing in key and I'm on drums, because almost all of these are drums and almost all of them are in a weirder key. And I put this kind of pad bank in here just in case like I got a little bit bored doing just drums and I wanted to add a little texture or something. I had these here. Now, I don't really know why I thought this would work, and I'll tell you right now, spoiler alert, I didn't touch this one at all. But they sounded kind of funky, and, I was just experimenting things, so I just wanted to kind of keep this one in mind. Let's keep it around. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I have very little confidence that I'll be able to sync my BPM with the other musicians. If you're a more seasoned SP404 head than I am, then, maybe you can make this work. I could not. However, in the off chance that I will be brave enough to try playing multiple instruments at one time, I figured it couldn't hurt to pull up with a few pre-programmed chord changes, drum beats, etc. using the pattern sequencer. So, most drum kits and chords that I brought in here have a few patterns that I cooked up as well. Yeah, again, they're not all that great, but I just cooked them up just in case. So there you have it. That's 3 cards, all ready to go. Around 10 o'clock at night, I pulled up to the electric gym, just me and my SP404, and the first round would begin. I got paired up with a cool dude called Duan Luo, and we've run in the same circle before. He's really big into the modular scene. He spoke a bit of English too. Like, he's a cool guy. His gear of choice was an Electron Octatrack. Now, infamously, I don't know too much about how the Electron line works, but from what I understand, the Octatrack is also a sampler, a much more advanced sampler than the SP404. A sampler duet, let's see how this works. So he asked if he could only do drums. Perfect. That's the strategy, right? I could do anything except for drums, and he would just focus on keeping the beat. That's the ideal way to work, just to start out. All right, so I immediately decided to go for the Kiwi card, just because it was the one that I knew the best, and I knew there was plenty I wanted to try out. I also could just totally ignore the drums. And that would kind of give me the best chance to make a good impression on the crowd, using the card that I knew the best. So we were real slow to start. He was pretty far from the mixer, so it took a minute or two to get his audio up to speed. I had to fill the air while the show was starting, which is awesome, because guess what I prepared? The ambience helped, immediately. It killed the silence, created a good mood, and gave me something to play chopped samples against. I was an outsider here. From what I understand, everyone is expecting bleeps and bloops and 4 to the floor electronic music stuff, not samples. Opening with vocal chops is a very fun way to subvert expectations. The real fun began when Duan Luo joined in. Dude, it clicked, right? It was a good mix of vocal chops set to a really intense drum beat. We just kept going like that for the first 5 minutes of the show. The critical moment came when it was time to try and switch to a different bank, switching to something else, right? I was nice and comfortable with my vocal chops, but now was the golden moment to see if we could actually do something else. So I immediately went for my favorite instrument, the CM chord bank in H. So good, damn near flawless. This was 2 successful experiments right out of the gate. I was feeling good, and I just knew right there that this experiment was a good idea and totally worth the effort. The vibe for this performance was super strong, and it worked really, really well. I tried a bunch of different things throughout the show. I tried almost every bank I had on Kiwi card. Some things worked better than others, but subjectively, everything seemed to keep the energy up, and nothing sounded too out of place. At one point, I was able to put the bass bank to good use and take a sort of like bass solo thing. That lasted like 20 seconds, if I remember. Another fun moment was the Daegun flute and cycling through the different effects, like the MFX, DJFX looper, to give it some sort of like life and not just playing back the samples on their own. This sort of sound design, you know, it won't fly at every jam, but if you are at an electric jam like this, the crowd is a little bit more used to the occasional like, harsh noise, and sometimes it'll work out, right? You may not have many samples, but you do have a whole bunch of MFX you can try to layer on top of your sample bank. I think the biggest unexpected success out of this whole experiment was spreading one instrument across two banks, right? Switching between one-shots and chords and the little note flares on the siendo banks here, it worked so well, and I sort of wish I did this for every instrument. So don't leave any pads empty. You will need every pad you can get your fingers to, right? And there's just no chance in the heat of everything you're going to remember that, pad 3 is blank, right? Or whatever pad is blank. You know, vary things up, make sure your banks are flushed out, and give yourself plenty to work with. All right, gain staging and just overall keeping your levels balanced, super critical, right? If one of your banks is way too loud or way too quiet, it'll stick out like a sore thumb. And when you try to play it live, like that's the thing that people are gonna notice. If you're trying to play something and all of a sudden it's like very quiet in the mix, or if you just break everyone's ears with something that's way too loud. So you have to aggressively, above all else, just make sure everything is balanced with regards to levels. There was one bank, I think it was in the Cherry kit, I can't remember, but I just kind of had to throw out 12 samples because they were all too quiet and I didn't have time to go through and adjust the levels on all of them. I couldn't bring the levels of everything else down. I couldn't try to resample them. I just didn't have time. So I lost one of those leads, and that was my fault for not balancing things beforehand. So make sure you listen to your collaborator, right? If you're trying to manually play in time like I was, you need to follow along. Duan Luo was great, right? He listened to me too and was able to kind of vary up his drum kits quite a bit. But listening to each other is really what's going to give that special energy. And Duan Luo and I just kind of clicked, so that worked out great. So if you're stuck trying to decide if you should use gate samples or one-shot samples, the answer is both, and be prepared to turn that on and off. There were multiple instances where in one performance, I wanted to switch between how the samples would play back, both. Sometimes I wanted them to one-shot, and sometimes I wanted to, play them with a gate. I kept going back and forth, to be honest. There was no one answer of which one served me better. It is really nice to have the one-shot gate just be able to fade out like that. That is quite helpful. Also, if you're chopping samples for this, like chopping on the SP404 to do the preparation, just make sure you truncate everything beforehand, because there were a couple times where I ended up marking a sample while I was performing. And I did that because either an attack was too long, or maybe I wanted to hear like a different word in the vocal chop. Just make sure you truncate your stuff beforehand. It'll save you some time. Something you should get super comfortable with is auditioning your MFX, right? I know this is like intermediate level SP404 skill, but I swear it is so tricky to use things like DJFX Looper when you're doing this stuff live. Like when you're playing back a sample, right? And you turn on the DJFX Looper, and all of a sudden your output cuts because the last time you used it, you spun down to 0 and didn't spin back up. Or, God forbid, you try to add the filter and all of a sudden, whatever reason you left the distortion on. So, general rule is if you want to use DJFX Looper while you're playing, or whatever else effect it is, double tap, Make sure you audition it, make sure everything is where you want it to be first, and then go for your effect. I counted 6 times during my performance, at least 6, where the DJ looper just completely killed my output signal because I was actually at 0% playback speed and had to quickly spin up from 0 because I didn't reset the effects properly. Again, peanut brain. Lastly, those 15 minutes from the show went super quickly, right? You will lose track of time. So don't hesitate to try new things. Don't get stuck doing one thing for too long. And also, I completely tore through the Kiwi card in an attempt to make sure that my sound was varied enough. So, for reference, one full SD card lasted me about 15 minutes of performance. Now, that's not always the case, right? That's not a true milestone, but it just goes to show bringing multiple SD cards if you're going to do more than one improv session. SD cards are super cheap, right? Fill them up, bring as many as you can prepare. Kiwi card, round 1, both ended up being a great success. On to round 2. Next up, I was paired with the event host, a guy called Mama. He pulled up with an Analog 4, another Electron machine. I don't totally understand what this one is. It's some kind of synth, like an analog synth, I guess. He asked if he could play acid bass.
Analog 1, so maybe stay to 10.
Okay.
Yeah. A minor.
A minor, 可以吗？好了。
I had totally exhausted the Kiwi card and had 2 fighters left, so I kind of had a hard time choosing because I don't really know how acid-based music works. I had to choose between a genre card and an instrument card. That's like picking between. There's not a right answer. That's like picking apples or oranges, except now it's like a cherry card and a blueberry card. I don't know. I'm a moron. I don't even need fruit. Cherry card. Let's do it. Oh, and this time I was brave. I brought this overhead camera. Right. I set this up with a little LED light so that I could show you this process better, all for the experiment. I did this for you, YouTube, and I definitely looked crazy setting it up on stage, so I hope it was worth it. Admittedly, the beginning was rough. It was not nearly as easy as round 1. Why? Because the bass frequencies from the Analog 4 were real low, and admittedly, a little hard for me to hear and kind of groove to. I will admit that I couldn't find the 1. I couldn't find the downbeat, and I didn't really know how to get started. Not to mention, again, I don't know acid music or what genre are we playing? Should I do a 4 to the floor beat, or should I play something faster? Like, what even is our BPM? Bad start, okay? And I may have panicked a little bit. But then I remembered finger drumming on the SP404 is super dope and will always save you and make you look cool. For almost the entire 15-minute show, I finger drummed like my life depended on it. It was exhausting, like physically and mentally. I didn't even switch banks that often, just because I didn't want to risk losing the groove that much. But the important thing is that the audience, they were dancing, they were staring, they were like all engaged. Like they liked watching a musician go, like a musician doing their own thing. I just didn't want to take any risk to kind of break that. And surprisingly enough, finger drumming and an analog bass machine together, like, that's more compelling of a performance and less repetitive than you might think. Now, I didn't always keep perfect rhythm with my partner, but like, if you're listening to the video, like, I kind of always got back in time. It always generally worked. lot of electronic music, especially improvised, is very slow to evolve, right? People don't always expect the whole dynamic range of sound to be filled out by just two musicians. If you're watching like a concert, then of course, but improvised, like not many people can change their sounds that often. The same issues you deal with on an SP404, electronic musicians are dealing with their gear as well. Like you can't just transform things too quickly, especially if you're building it from, the ground up. But if you're doing something with your hand, like every single second of the show, odds are the audience will be generally engaged. All right, after 10 minutes of straight finger drumming, I would have really liked a more expansive kit. Okay, so when you make your kits, make sure they have plenty of different sounds. I also would have loved easier access to the samples, right? The drum kit's over here on E, but then the samples are over here in F. Right, it's not that hard to switch between them, but I found when I was playing live, like just the fact that they're kind of far away and I had their opposite, literally opposite sides on the guide, it wasn't the fastest thing to be able to switch between. You might have more experience with that kind of switching than I do, but I just felt that was like inhibiting me from being able to play more easily. But whenever I did play a sample, people acknowledged it. People seemed to really appreciate it. Mama really liked it, my collaborator. Moving between banks is something you need to optimize and rehearse and just be prepared for. And if you do want to do something weird just because it's geeky and fun, like, go for it. Just be prepared that it's going to eat up some of your precious sample space. But odds are it's going to be worth it. So ideally, you want to develop a muscle memory of what each of these banks has in store for you, right? I had this guide with me for both sets, and I just didn't feel quite as comfortable with the Cherry kit as I did with the Kiwi kit. Mainly because I built the Kiwi kit entirely on my own, and this one I was just a little bit less familiar with. I found this one bank that worked for the set, and I stuck to it for the most part. I really should have been able to use the whole card. And part of that is just preparing better. But also, I didn't really need leads throughout the whole show. I really needed drums. So maybe I didn't use the right card for this set, but it definitely worked as well as I could expect it to. Overall, in a jam, you're only really expected to do one thing at a time. You don't have to feel pressure to fill in every empty space, especially if there's like only two of you jamming. Like this jam had like a bass player and a drummer, but there was no one to like do the equivalent of singing or playing a guitar. There was no one there to do the lead. So we both kind of had to do that a little bit. Sometimes you just got to stick to one job and do it as well as you can. And I think that's what I did here for the most part. I shouldn't have felt anxious or panicked. It was a brief moment, but like when you're improvising, you might lose the vibe. And that's fine. The crowd are there to watch the process. And they'll be more impressed that you're making it up as you go than if you just press one button and wanted to show off what you made before, right? Sometimes you're going to lose the one. And just try and figure out how to make it work. Again, listening to your collaborator is huge. At one point, Mama and I sort of we knew we lost one another, so he cooked up a bass line without a one, just kind of a constant tone, and it worked great. It gave me all the space I needed to kind of jump around a little bit before finally kind of getting back onto the beat. And that was it. That was the end of the Electric Gym. Next one is on SP404 Day, April 4th. If you happen to be in China for whatever reason, come on by Chengdu and come jam. The next morning, my buddy invited me out to jam the next night with them at a reggae bar in town. And my first thought was like, great, more data for this crazy SP404 experiment. Social life? Psh, nah, man, science. Let's do this. Jabar is the only reggae bar in Chengdu. It's a dank little spot by the river, cheap gear, amps, but there's guitars there, the beer is super cheap, and anytime, any day, you can just walk in, pick up one of their instruments, and just jam, right? It's a super cool spot. The idea is that the energy there changes every hour, depending on who shows up and what time you go. If you don't have any expectations, just come ready to jam with whoever's there. So it looked like the Blueberry card might have its time to shine this weekend. Now, I didn't get any footage of the first jam, and I didn't want to I didn't want to spook anyone. I didn't want to set up cameras and stuff. That's not the vibe, right? But let me tell you a bit about what I did learn. Now, this was a new venue, new audience, so I figured I could break out the Kiwi card again and give that another try. I put way more work into that one, so I was the most familiar with it, and it really showed. This like kind of rock and roll crowd, the underground scene, is way more forgiving when it comes to chord changes and staying in key. Hell, most of the time it was just A minor, no chord change at all, right? We just kind of stayed in A minor, like almost almost every jam. If you're gonna play with a band, then yeah, you can be more prepared. But if you're only out here to jam and improvise, just to kind of practice your chops, like I said, A minor and D minor, really, really safe bets. Now, if there's a drum kit, you don't need drums. Okay, seriously, rock and roll drummers are very good at leading the beat and filling the air with every piece of like kit that they have. If you want to add some percussion, sure, clever. But there's a drummer, you don't need to compete for the beat, right? Really, you have that opportunity to focus on something else. This is also my chance to play with some of the leads, so they did come in handy. Both the Blueberry kit and the Cherry kit, they both helped here. You know, there was already guitar, bass, drum already going. Sometimes just having a little 4-note melody on top of that could go a really long way to glue the whole thing together and add some cohesiveness and give the song kind of something to sing along to or whatever it is. Also, there were a few points where I did manage to use the patterns that I programmed. If the jam stopped and someone wanted to keep going and there's like 2 of us on stage, we needed a drum kit, I could just quickly load up one of the drums that I made, right? And it would just kind of start, and then we could both play over that drum kit. So the patterns were helpful, and I didn't need to synchronize with anyone. For a small jam, it's great just to have them loaded up. So definitely keep a few patterns on standby in case you're ever mano a mano with a guitar player and you need to give them a full sonic environment to jam into. Having patterns, or in this case, resampled loops, also fine. So was that it? Is that the end of the SP404 experiment? No, it wasn't. Absolute chaos, okay? Some dude showed up with a Nord Stage 3 and immediately started dropping like augmented chords, like proper jazz progressions that I can't even follow. And it just made the jam a lot harder for everyone, and lots of people just straight up left. But I just, I'd come this far and I wasn't gonna give up now. I wanted to make sure you guys got all the data I could get you, so I decided I was gonna ride this thing to the end, which ended up being 4 a.m. in the morning. Those vocal chops were such a vibe, okay? They just fit into every genre that I ended up playing against. Again, really representing what a sampler can do and bringing this sort of bringing an element to the jam that nothing else really could. Not even like a lead singer has that sort of unique vibe of an SP404 vocal chop. Overall advice, just get a lot of samples. I wish I was better at that, and I wish I had more, because that's the kind of thing people never really hear in a live jam, and that's the kind of thing that is really intriguing and complementary to traditional musical instruments. At one point during the jam, we sort of played musical chairs, right? No pun intended. And we ended up all on just different instruments, right? I was behind the helm of this crazy Nord stage, and my new Ukrainian friend Sergio ended up with an SP404 in his lap for the very first time. Finger drumming is a very accessible skill to any musician with a sense of rhythm. This was the moment where I was really happy I had some percussion kits. If you're with any musician friend, or you want to make friends with musicians who aren't in the beat making realm, just offer them a chance to finger drum on a percussion kit or even a drum kit, and then they're going to kind of get, for the most part, what sampling is all about. So the experiment had come to an end, again at 4 a.m. in the morning, 2 evenings of jams, and I had successfully tried almost every single thing I had on these cards, right? I've already analyzed all this data for you throughout the video, and I hope you learned something, but for those of you who skipped everything and just coming here to the end, let me hit you with the biggest lessons overall. Have purpose-built cards, okay? Know as much as you can going into a jam and be prepared for pretty much like anything. If you're gonna be the drummer, then have a bunch of the drum kits at the ready. If you're playing with a drummer though, then load up a card with a bunch of more chords or leads, right? Know your place in the jam and know what it is you're expected to bring. You can prepare patterns, but don't rely on them. Again, up for debate, but don't ever count on leading BPM or receiving a proper MIDI sync from someone else. Having some patterns lined up were very, very, very helpful for smaller jams, and more helpful than having resampled loops because I could change the tempo if I needed. But you just gotta be ready to finger drum and switch between multiple instruments. So have patterns on the standby, but don't rely on them. Practice bank switching. Try to get comfortable playing multiple banks at one time, right? Play a sample that has like a one shot in one bank, and then play another sample in another bank. Just get as comfortable as you can playing across multiple banks, because if you stick to only 4 and you're too nervous to try and switch to other banks, you're limiting the number of sounds you can make. This leads me to my next point, which might be the most important, okay? Experiment first. Don't commit to any idea until you've tried it, right? Now, if you look at this guide that I made, I committed to a really complex plan because, this is an experiment and I wanted to try a lot of things at one time and then report back on how they worked. You, on the other hand, I'm only doing this so you can learn from my mistake. You need to put in the hours and see what works for you. Sometimes chords sound muddled if you play more than one at a time, right? Sometimes your lead sucks and you just don't have time to play it. Sometimes your samples are way cooler than anything else and you need to rebuild the other patterns around it. Sometimes the idea you had for a kit doesn't work, right? Sometimes your idea for a card doesn't work. A genre-based card was not a very good idea, and I admit that now. And these are the kind of things you kind of have to wrestle with and figure out. Take the lessons I'm able to teach you here, but you do need to kind of figure some of this stuff out on your own as well. Don't build a big plan and then put it into action. Try one kit at a time, one card at a time, and build up from there. Another tip, build it yourself, okay? Don't just use sample packs or pre-built banks, because if I learned anything from the Kiwi kit, it's that all the time I went into sampling and building these kits myself really paid off, okay? The kits I brought in from Machina didn't really serve me well, just because I didn't have the muscle memory of what they were and how they sounded like. There was never a moment while jamming where I thought, oh yeah, the Deep London would be perfect for this, right? Conversely, I thought, ooh, that dusty lo-fi drum, that's what I need right now. So make sure you develop the memory of what you're building and what you're making, and use kits that you make yourself, and it will generally go farther and just commit to you being a more unique and individual musician. Use versatile vocal chops. That's what saved me more than anything else, okay? Also, that's the kind of thing only you can bring to a jam. Find some vocal chops out there. You can use them in practically any jam. Get a couple different keys, get one key, whatever it is. Vocal chops are the answer here. Prepare for the heat of the moment, okay? That means things aren't going to work like they do at home. Things sound different through different speakers. Something you thought you memorized is definitely going to escape you when you're on stage. Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. Just relax, prepare yourself, and get real familiar with the samples that you chose, okay? You will never memorize all 120 pads, and you'll never remember what your patterns sound like. If you're not familiar with a certain card, make sure you foolproof it so that you can press whatever and it's going to sound good. And simplify whenever possible. You have a lot less mental bandwidth on stage than you do when you're at home, or less than you'll ever expect. Don't expect to have any time to make any decisions on stage. Keep things simple and do your future self some favors. Just keep things Simple. At a jam, you usually have one job, okay? Even though it would be dope to manage multiple instruments and sounds at a time, real talk, at normal jams, people play one instrument at a time, normally. We only have two hands, so don't focus on too many things. Don't hesitate to stick to only one bank or one instrument at a time. Keep things, again, simple. Multiple banks for one instrument. Putting one instrument in bank C and H was the most comfortable thing I could ever rely on this card, and I'm now going to just do this forever. It might behoove you to consider having 5 banks with 24 pads each instead of having 10 banks with 12 sounds each. Because, again, memory and mental bandwidth on stage is quite a bit weaker. And just knowing that each button does one thing and just switching between, like, front and back, you know, having top and down, that just made so much more sense to me than I expected. I rarely used all 10 banks in a jam just because I didn't have the mental capacity to consider which one to switch to. But I knew that I could press this button immediately and have more of the same. So you might want to consider simplifying your banks as well. Listen, always listen to what the other musician is doing. It's a jam, after all, not a solo performance. Any one of us can keep a rhythm, but it takes some real skill to actually add something to the music that's being made. This was something I struggled with for years and years before I got into the SP404, right? Don't worry about doing too much. You can stay in your pocket and just do a little bit at a time, right? You can also just take a break and not play just to listen to what the other artist or artists are doing. It's totally fine, right? It's helpful even. 2 quick bonus topics here. 1, sample in mono, just to make sure you have 12 voice polyphony if you want it. And 2, copy your SD cards to your computer when you're done cooking them up, right? That night, I left my little bag of SD cards at the bar, and even though I have all my main setups backed up, I didn't think to back up these live sets, and I was pretty bummed. I thought I wouldn't be able to get them back. I did, but regardless, make sure you back this stuff up. It takes like less than 5 minutes and maybe like a ½ gigabyte of space on your hard drive. It's not bad. So the big answer to the big question is, yeah, of course you could use the SP404 as an instrument. Of course you could bring it to a live jam and you can prepare to play it live with other musicians. It's going to have its limits, but it's very unique and it's something people will tend to appreciate and enjoy. I would love to facilitate more opportunities for you beat makers to intermingle with more traditional instrumentalists and come up with like cool, great things. It's all about preparation, and it's pretty distinctly different from normal SP404 usage, but it's a great exercise, it's super fun, and it's just a great way to socialize too. So, wherever you are in the world, if there's open jams at some tiny bar or live house that you've never been to because you don't have an instrument, I say give this a try. If you've always wanted to join like a band, but you chose kind of the more solitary life of a beat maker, I say give it a try. This thing can really do a lot. Get out there, please share your advice in the comments because there's no way this approach is the only one. And you guys have probably already learned so much about this that I don't know yet. I couldn't cover everything in this video, so give it a try. Thank you all so much for the support. I like quadrupled my YouTube followers this month since my first SP404 video. It's been providing me a lot of opportunities in real life, IRL. So, thanks again for watching, subscribing, hit me in the comments and Instagram, and see you next time.